Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG-TV, radio, online, news that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Up front this week, the continuing controversy over immigration policy in the United States. Across the country, protesters are calling for comprehensive immigration reform and a permanent solution for dreamers, young people who benefit from DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program started by President Obama. Recently, protesters took to the streets in Las Cruces, and Michael Hernandez was there.
No justice, no peace. If we don't get it, shut it down! Shut it down! Shut it down!
NM Cafe, a faith-based community group, is taking part in protests across the country to oppose the treatment of undocumented immigrants. Organizer Johanna Bencomo says Cafe chose to rally outside the U.S. District Court for a reason.
In Las Cruces, we decided that the federal courthouse where they process immigrants and criminalize the American dream was a point of crisis for our community, and we wanted to shed light to what happens here because many in our community don't know.
Protesters arrived to oppose Operation Streamline, a federal program created in 2005 that fast-tracks prosecutions for undocumented immigrants. After they're arrested, immigrants are bused to federal courthouses and criminally charged in groups for crossing the border. Those who enter the country illegally are charged with a misdemeanor, and re-entry gets them a felony. Bencomo says she worries the number of immigrants prosecuted will increase under President Trump.
We fear that the Trump administration only wants to increase this process and wants to start putting people through this system that have lived in our community for a long time.
The Department of Justice reported nearly 60,000 immigration prosecutions in fiscal year 2017. That's down nearly 15% compared to the year before, according to track report data from Syracuse University. Protesters, like the ones you see behind me, say that immigrants prosecuted under Operation Streamline are treated unfairly.
Several people can be forced to go through before a judge at a time, and it's just not a legal standard that any American would be proud of or would accept for themselves. All that they've done is come to this country to try and pursue a better life, and we treat them like criminals, we shackle them, and just it's really dehumanizing to treat people this way.
While they didn't block the streets, protesters did sit down to block the entrance for vehicles entering the courthouse. But buses transporting immigrants arrived before the protesters did. Anna Keeney says immigration is an issue close to her heart.
My father was an immigrant and came to this country and was welcomed. I mean, I don't know if he was necessarily welcomed. No immigrant group has really been welcomed, but was able to be given opportunity and to work hard and to provide for our family. And I really feel like we've lived the American dream, and it really breaks my heart that we're treating immigrants this way one generation later. It seems like we never learned this lesson.
Demonstrators advocated for Dreamers in response to Congress failing to meet President Trump's deadline of March 5th to solve DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. CAFE leader and DACA recipient Carlos Corral says he wants people to know that Dreamers are like anybody else.
I'm a student, firefighter, server, I do community things that anybody else would, and we're just like anybody else. We were raised together and we pledged to the same flag.
State officials also attended the protest to speak out. Representative Bill McCamley says Dreamers are as American as he is and deserve a path to citizenship.
Why are we denying folks the chance at coming here, working hard, and making a better life for themselves and their kids? We shouldn't be. This is what America is about, and it is so damn important for all of us to get up and really say, what is patriotism? What is the American dream? And how can we all live it? Rounding up immigrants and deporting them, even though they're contributing to our society and doing all the right things that they're supposed to be, is not that.
NM Cafe says it plans to organize more events and hopes to meet with state congressional leaders. For KRWG, I'm Michael Hernandez.
We see you. Hello and welcome to another episode of In Focus. I'm Anthony Moreno. KRWG is continuing our conversation with candidates who are running for the Democratic nomination for governor in New Mexico. Today we are joined with us in studio is State Senator Joseph Cervantes. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you, Anthony.
Now I'd like to start off a pretty simple question that I've been asking all the candidates who are running in New Mexico this year. Why are you seeking this seat as governor of New Mexico?
Well, I've served in the legislature for a number of years, both in the House and Senate, and I've been able to accomplish a lot of things that I think are important in moving New Mexico ahead. But the fact of the matter is there's only so much you can do in those positions, and the greatest opportunity to make the biggest difference in New Mexico right now is by electing a good, strong governor.
Now tell us a little bit about yourself. You're from southern New Mexico, so tell us a little bit about your upbringing and what you're about.
Well, first, it's great to be in your studio here in Las Cruces. My office is just down the street here. I grew up in La Mesa, New Mexico. Most folks know where Chopez is at, and our farm is a few blocks away from there. It's the same farm that my grandparents started, and my parents and now my brother and sister and I farm right along the Rio Grande in La Mesa. Came to school here in Las Cruces, went to UNM for architecture and law, and brought my wife Jennifer back here to start our family. She's been a professor here at the university. She's been involved at the university and now an author. So we have very deep ties to the university here at New Mexico State and to Las Cruces.
Now, one of the issues that I noticed on your website that you seem to be really passionate about and addressing and that you think you can make a difference is education. Tell me how you think New Mexico is doing with education right now. What are some of the things that you would change, and what would you implement if elected governor here?
I think what we don't hear enough about when it comes to education is that there is a great education system in place for a lot of kids. So Jennifer and I raised our 3 daughters here in Las Cruces Public Schools. They graduated from Las Cruces High School. They've had, frankly, an opportunity to go to any college in this country based on merit alone. They've scored well enough in their national testings and rankings. They can go anywhere, and they're a product of our Las Cruces Public Schools. So that's the great story. The problem is that we have too many kids who are not getting that same opportunity. They're dropping out of school, they're not getting the resources in our public schools. And so we have a great public education system, but we need to make it available and accessible to more people.
Making it available and accessible to more people. What about early childhood education? How do you think the state is doing in that? Is the state doing enough to make sure early childhood education is accessible for New Mexico's children?
No, we're not doing enough. And again, that's an example where in the case of our 3 daughters, they started in preschool and early programs with church groups and so forth. So they got socialized early. They got an early opportunity with teachers and early academic exposure to various things. So those were good things. We need to make sure that everybody from Sutherland Park, which I represent now, all through our county and really all the way up the state to all of our borders have the same opportunities. It's hard because New Mexico is a rural state, but we can do it, and that's the way to get kids coming to school ready to learn.
But how do we do it? How do we fund it?
Well, there's talk about using some of the permanent fund monies to do that, and I think that's something that I can support. Again, what's not understood is you hear a lot of folks talking about use of those permanent funds and what you can and can't do with them. In fact, in this campaign, you hear some candidates talking about using it for all kinds of things. The fact of the matter is our state constitution limits what you can use that for, and it's limited to education. So to the extent we're talking about using some of that permanent fund money or additional permanent fund money to fund early education, then that's something we should all get behind.
You said that, obviously you've been in the legislature. It's been a problem to even get the legislature to agree on that issue. What do you think's been holding it up?
Well, that's a great question because most people don't understand why it gets held up. And the fact of the matter is that you have a lot of people, again, including candidates in this race, who want to use those permanent funds for things you just can't constitutionally do. Well, we need to understand the land grant permanent fund was created when we became a state. So it's part of our constitution from the beginning. It's part of the federal law that allowed New Mexico to become a state. So you just can't go into that fund. And it's important to understand, too, that that fund right now is used to open the doors to our public schools and, frankly, to New Mexico State University, to UNM, to many of our 21 institutions in the state. They all use the revenue that fund generates. So diverting that to other uses is something that the legislature's been cautious about doing. And you're right, there's been some resistance to that because if you're taking that money for some purpose other than education, the people that are receiving that money now, including here at NMSU, are going to have to find an alternative source.
How do you feel, speaking about funding and education, the state obviously last legislative session was in a budget crunch in 2017. The state took money from school districts around the state, didn't pay it back in full. How do you feel about that, and what would you do if in a position of, say, governor, if in a situation like that?
Well, I wouldn't put ourselves in that position, but this governor did so. In essence, this governor came into office and took a pledge that she would never find alternative sources of revenue or raise any revenue. So when our state revenues plummeted because of oil and gas prices falling, she wouldn't replace that revenue, at least on the surface.
Well, the state legislature, though, did pass a budget, and they didn't pay it back in full.
Well, what happened is the legislature did what it had to do, which is to balance the budget and keep our schools open. They went every place they could go to find money. You're looking for quarters under the cushions in the sofa. And in this case, what the legislature did is it went in and swept up all of the monies that had been held back or reserved by school districts. School districts rightfully try to budget their year by holding back some of their money and evening their revenues in throughout the year. And the legislature essentially went in and swooped in and took all of that money. It was needed, and there was no choice. But the fact of the matter is, it's a farce to argue that we didn't raise revenues. I'll give you my best example. Jennifer and I have two of our daughters at UNM, and when you're a student here at New Mexico State, we can tell the state that we didn't raise taxes on them. The governor may say she didn't raise taxes, but the reality is if you're a college student here at NMSU, your family, your friends, your own tuition and fees have increased. It's a hidden tax. It's a tax that doesn't look like a tax, but it's certainly something that's being paid by our students and our families.
I'd like to talk about that a little later, but still with education, one of the issues that New Mexico faces is paying teachers equally the amount of a starting salary that other states pay. For example, Texas may have a teacher starting off nearly $10,000 more. How do you keep top talent in New Mexico to want to take part in education? What are your thoughts on that? Are we paying teachers enough?
Well, again, it's as we talked about earlier things, it's a tale of two New Mexicos. So for example, if you look at some of the news reports in the last few days, New Mexico's average teacher pay may rank 19th in the country and actually higher than Texas when you take averages across the state. But in parts of our state, teachers aren't earning enough. It becomes particularly important here in southern New Mexico because teachers can go across the street and work in El Paso or in Texas and earn more money. So you're right, we have to be doing more to attract more teachers. We're not getting enough teachers that are coming into NMSU to study education and pursue that as a profession, and we do that with better salaries. But the fact of the matter is that, again, some of our numbers are good, and so some of our teachers are earning good salaries, but not enough of them are.
One of the things I found interesting last legislative session was the state legislature passed a bipartisan bill to provide more computer science learning opportunities for students in New Mexico. The governor vetoed it without explanation. It's kind of up in limbo in courts as we tape this program. What are your thoughts on computer science education and expanding those opportunities? Because as we're looking at reports from the Department of Labor Statistics, there are going to be more jobs that require computational thinking or understanding of computer science in New Mexico. We have national labs, we have universities, we have all sorts of tech opportunities perhaps. But are New Mexicans going to be able to fill those jobs if we are not training students in computer science education?
We've got to do it, and that's where NMSU, UNM, and our other colleges and universities can be leaders, and even our public schools. I mean, the fact of the matter is I'm 57, we've raised the three girls. I've seen the technology change as a parent in the way they learn. In fact, years ago I successfully passed legislation to require that all of our textbooks that are sold in New Mexico, sold to our state by vendors, that they're all available digitally and electronically because, again, kids at home need to access them. Their tablets or notebooks are ways to carry those books around. That's the way people learn these days. That's the way people work these days. So we need to change with the times. And the fact of the matter is, with so much of our state being rural, the way that people can continue to live in rural New Mexico and still get good jobs and do good things is online.
Well, online, I mean, much of our state still has to get updated with broadband infrastructure. What are some of the ways you think you could implement that? I've talked to some small rural school districts where before they had broadband, they had to rely on a van to pull up to with computers in the van or truck so that the students could, get an understanding of, what a computer is or to access online information.
Well, the great thing about New Mexico is because we're a relatively small state from a population standpoint, we should be able to get these issues taken care of and quickly. You're right, we passed this in the legislature last year. The governor vetoed it without an explanation. I'm trusting the Supreme Court's going to overturn her veto because we think she did it incorrectly. But the fact of the matter is, as a candidate for governor, I'm going to rural parts of the state, and people want to continue to live in those rural parts of the state. They want to be able to offer opportunities to their children. And the only way that's going to happen is by allowing them to be able to work at home, work from their computers, and continue to keep ahead of the technology curve by making that accessible.
I want to move on and talk about New Mexico's economy. I don't think it's any secret to anyone that New Mexico is still struggling to regain its position and to strengthen its economy after the Great Recession. Some states have turned to legalizing recreational use of marijuana. You have a different position, and you have stated that you are against that. Why are you against that? And could you explain us why you feel that way?
Well, it's more that New Mexico is not ready for that yet. So
why is New Mexico not ready?
Well, if you look at the states that have legalized marijuana, they're different than New Mexico in one important way. If you look at Colorado, Nevada, Washington, Oregon, California, all of them have very low rates of drug abuse on our highways, DWI rates. New Mexico still has a very high rate of DWI in our state. We have to get our existing problems under control before we start to, I think, move into areas where New Mexico hasn't been successful. So right now we don't have a good infrastructure in place, if you will, to make sure that we don't have people.
Tell me about that infrastructure, though. What do you think needs to be in place before you can support something like this? I know that you have supported the decriminalization of marijuana, but we're talking about recreational use. The other candidates running in the Democratic primary support this. What type of infrastructure do you need in place so that you can support something like that?
Well, I'm not entirely sure that the others support it. Congressman Grisham initially said she would, and now she's backing away from that. And the fact of the matter is that Democrat governors in the states that have legalized marijuana have seen some of the issues and initially didn't support it either there. So it's important to note the difference between decriminalization. We shouldn't be putting people in jail and using the resources of our judicial system to deal with drug problems. But the fact of the matter is that when it comes to alcohol, for example, people know that if you blow a .08 into an toxilizer machine, you're going to get convicted of a DWI. We have very clear standards. We have the equipment, the testing, the infrastructure is what I call it, to know how to enforce those laws. We don't have anything like that for marijuana. There's no test, there's no machine, there's no standard. We should know what those things are so that we know how to enforce those laws. And I'll just tell you, I lost my college roommate, I lost a girlfriend, I lost my law partner to DWI drunk drivers. And I have fought for many years in New Mexico to keep drunk drivers off our roads. We need to recognize that remains a problem in our state before we begin to talk about legalizing marijuana and know how we're going to enforce that law.
Well, how do you think New Mexico needs to address this issue? We're talking about substance abuse is what you're talking about. That's obviously an issue in New Mexico that many folks are doing, not just alcohol. We have a rising cases of opioid abuse as well that the state is struggling with. How do you think you can address this challenge as governor and get people the support and help that they need?
Well, again, when we're talking about marijuana, we need to make sure that where it would be sold and who sells it and to whom it is sold are all very clear, and that we have laws in place to make sure that we don't have abuses there. We do that with alcohol. It's very clear. You've got to have the right kind of driver's license. You've got to be 21. We take away licenses of establishments that serve illegally. We have very clear infrastructure in place to make sure that we don't abuse alcohol or the sale of alcohol. Again, none of that is in place for marijuana. And again, it can be done, and it will be done, I have no doubt, but they need to be coming up together. We shouldn't legalize it and then figure out later how we're going to deal with things like sales and where it's going to be sold and who's going to sell it.
Still talking about, I want to bring back to, the economy here in New Mexico. New Mexico let the renewable tax credit expire for renewable energy, I should say. Tax credit expire. What are your thoughts on that? If elected as governor, how would you address renewable energy and raising revenues for the state?
Well, I'm real fortunate in the Senate to serve as the chairman of the Conservation Committee. That's the committee that my colleagues in the Senate have asked me to chair that deals with renewable energy. It's the committee that deals with our water and all of our natural resources, as well as wind and solar energy and other renewables. So it's something that I've worked on hard. I was part of getting that passed again this last session. Unfortunately, the governor just vetoed it again. And so we need to recognize New Mexico can be a leader in this area. New Mexico State, UNM, our universities can be leaders in graduating students with those backgrounds, with the research that it's going to take. We can turn that around in New Mexico, and the fact of the matter is the economy is going to drive that. The price of renewables is coming down dramatically, and as a result of that, more and more people are going to turn to renewables.
I want to move on now to public safety because we just have a few minutes left. I know this seems to be like a major issue that dominated the last legislative session. You've been involved with some legislation in addressing that issue. What are your thoughts on how the state needs to address crime and public safety?
What we need to do is very different than what the last 8 years have been about, which is trying to pass laws to increase penalties. The fact of the matter is that we have the same penalties in Las Cruces as we do in Albuquerque, but Albuquerque has a very serious problem with violent crime that Las Cruces doesn't have. Again, the same laws, but completely different results. The fact of the matter is, to address these problems, we need to have more police on the streets, they need to have better training, better resources, and we need a change in attitude that we can solve these problems, not let them continue to dominate us. And I think we can do that with the right leadership, both in the state and in our major cities. But the solution is not by locking up more people or creating more prisons or by increasing harsher penalties. That's not working anywhere.
So what I'm getting from you right now is that you think that the tough on crime approach is not working. Is that correct?
No, I wouldn't say it that way. What I would say is if you say tough on crime means increasing the maximum penalties, that doesn't work. You know, a criminal who's going in to commit a crime is not thinking about what the maximum penalty is, and they're not thinking, if it's 3 years, I won't do this. If it's 5 years, I won't do this. That kind of thought process doesn't go through a criminal's mind. So I wouldn't say, no, we don't need to be tough on crime. We do need to be tough on crime. But doing it with maximizing the upper end of penalties isn't getting us there. The criminals aren't thinking that way, and it's not a successful result. We need to be getting quicker through our courts. We need to be more uniform in prosecutions, and we need to make sure that people don't think they can get away with crime, and that's what's happening right now.
One of the major issues right now is we're seeing a lot of young people stand up and call for gun legislation, either at the state level or the federal level. What are your thoughts on that? Where do you stand on the issue as far as that goes?
Well, I applaud their activism, number one. Number two, last year I did something people said could never be done, which is I passed legislation in the Senate and in the House. We put it on the governor's desk. This would be a bill that would take guns out of households where there's been a finding by a court of domestic violence. We see too many cases where there's gun violence that follows a domestic violence situation. I passed laws that would have a court take the guns out of those environments. Unfortunately, the governor vetoed it. But the great thing was that people say you can't get gun legislation passed, you can't bring people together across party aisles. I brought Democrats and Republicans together. I did what people said couldn't be done, which passed gun legislation in New Mexico and put it on the governor's desk.
We only have a couple of minutes left, but a major issue still to talk about: health care. What do you think New Mexico needs to do a better job in addressing health care in the state? How do you think it's doing right now?
Well, we've been fortunate for the past many years because the federal government has been a big partner with the states in terms of delivery of things like Medicaid funding. The federal government today, under the Trump administration, seems to be pulling back from that. And so New Mexico has to realize that there are going to be a lot of resources that have been available to us as a state in the past that may not be there in the future. We're going to have to figure out how we're going to pay for our government. And the reality is right now, we're not paying for the government. As you said earlier, we were grabbing money from wherever we could find it, school districts and under the cushions of the sofa. We've got to begin to recognize that we have needs in our state and we've got to pay for them.
How big of an issue do you really think this is? I mean, if I'm correct, the last statistics, we have nearly 1 million people on Medicaid in the state as well. What can the state legislature do and the state government do? And if you're elected governor, what do you think is possible to really make sure more people are getting the help and health care that they need?
Well, we need to, first of all, find every opportunity we can to drive down the cost. So that means in terms of insurance, federal money, grant money, pharmaceutical prices, everything we can to bring the prices down. We need to try and enroll as many healthy people as we can into the system, again, so that the people that are ill and need the resources are being helped by the people who are healthy and paying into the system. And then we need to recognize that, again, New Mexico is a rural state to a large degree, and so we need to make sure the resources that are available, say in Las Cruces or at UNM Health Sciences, that those are available throughout the state by rural medicine, telemedicine, again, using technology as best we can. So those are things that will help drive down the price. But we need to recognize the feds may not be our partner the way they have in the past, and we're going to have to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps.
Senator Joseph Cervantes, thank you so much for joining us on In Focus.
Great to be with you today, and good to be at NMSU.
And we want to thank you for joining us for In Focus. I'm Anthony Moreno.
It's sticky and sweet. We use it in cooking and stir it in our tea. Let's discover what all the buzz is about as we explore honey. Honey making is a collaborative effort between nature and human beings, and it's been taking place since ancient times. It involves bee colonies, native plants, agricultural crops, and beekeepers. 1/3 of all food is dependent on bee pollination. There are between 60,000 and 90,000 bees that live in a hive, and they each have specific jobs. There is only one queen per hive, and she is in charge. During the summer, she can lay as many as 3,000 eggs per day. Each hive has around 200 drones, and their only job is to mate with the queen. The rest are female worker bees in charge of gathering nectar, making honey, and taking care of the other bees in the hive. Honeybees need to tap about 2 million flowers to make 1 pound of honey.
My favorite in the Southwest is acacia honey, but it's very difficult to get. And around New Mexico here, generally you can only get it in small amounts, and it has to be from a real specialty beekeeper that puts their hives where the acacias are, and that's whitethorn acacia. But the more prevalent one around here would be mesquite, and mesquite is the next finest. It has just this incredible flavor to it. And there also, we have like a valley blend here in the Mesilla Valley, and you get wonderful flavors from like the alfalfa that's grown here, and sometimes with the cotton and other wildflowers mixed in there.
In seed production, bees are very important. Unless a crop is wind pollinated, it must be pollinated by insects, and bees typically do the job. The same is true for fruit crops, where flowers must also be pollinated to produce the fruit. Aside from its use as a natural sweetener in food, honey and the wax created by honeybees can be used to make candles, lotions, balms, sealants, and cosmetics.
That's our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio. Every weekday, it's Morning Edition, 5 to 9, Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now, noon to 2, and All Things Considered, 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org, and we'd love to hear from you. Email us with your story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Fred Martino. Have a great week. We'll see you next time on Newsmakers.